et cetera. All these are part of what we know to be as racism. And something that many of us deal with on a daily basis. And so just wanted to level set and make sure that we're all on the same page when we have this discussion. Now moving on to media. What is media? Media can be so many different things, but we want to focus today for the purpose of this conversation on the areas listed on your screen. So that's why we have journalists here represented, as well as PR practitioners. We all have a role with regard to what is media and creating media and defining media. So now that we're all clear on how we're starting this out, here are the 3 areas that we're gonna cover. Because look, folks, we have an hour. We can't get through all of the discussion about racism in 1 hour, but we're gonna focus on 3 topics that we feel are pertinent to everybody on this call. And that's, first of all, images and language, right? We all deal with imagery and language every day. And how we do that makes a difference in anti-racist or racist behavior. It just depends on what you choose. Also, decision-making and hiring practices, right? That makes a difference in the product that we all put out. And then how do we cover or respond to injustice? That's a question that's come up in many newsrooms and many PR organizations, and we're going to approach it today. So want to get moving quickly and start with images and language. Want to put our journalist first. And Jared, you know I'm coming to you because I can see your face right now and you're smiling. But these 2 images, just wanted to bring this up. These are side-by-side images actually of Ferguson protests. And you'll look on the right of your screen, peaceful protests taking place, hundreds of folks. Then on your left side, you have one individual that would be looting. These were actually, as I'm told, considered the main photo for a story that was the same story, same day, just told different ways, depending on the publication. But this is just one example, folks. We're not asking this to lead the whole discussion, but this is one example. I mean, you think of another one that comes to mind in the Memphis mayoral election, the arguably racist caricature of Tammy Sawyer that was on the front cover of Memphis magazine. So my question to our Memphis panelists is, when you're in your newsroom, what do you do and how do you handle these editorial conversations? So we'll start with Jared, and Kelly, I see you next. So if you don't mind going next, if you would.
Well, this particular, hi Renee, first of all, I want to make sure I say hello and hello to everyone, all my fellow panelists, those of you who I work with often and those who I haven't met. I know Connie, we haven't met face to face, although we've emailed, so hello to you as well. And all the people who have logged on today, thank y'all so much for being a part of this conversation. Renee, to answer your question, this, if I can share an anecdote, reminded me of something that's happened recently since the pandemic. I went out with a Black freelance photographer to cover sort of like a drive-through graduation parade, sort of, and you know, wrote my story and saw it went up, and it had a picture, it had a photo gallery of a lot of beautiful pictures, a lot of beautiful images from the day. But included a picture of a graduate flashing, like fanning the money out and having the money spread out in his celebration. And I heard from the person who reached out for us to attend that event. And she said, I love the story. I think it's beautiful. I have a question about one photo. And I already knew what the photo was because it stood out in my mind as something that I was concerned about. But, you know, so often, you know, I won't say so often, but when things like that do happen and they raise my flag sort of as a reporter whose name is on a story and is, you know, as a Black man, you know, in order to be responsible and not overreach, I think I have to consider a lot of things of, you know, what my intentions are, what the intentions of the people who visualize are, and what the integrity of their job is, and reconcile that with mine. And it ended up sort of being a conversation where I had to really step out there and say, hey, I'm not comfortable with this. The person who invited us out is not comfortable with this. Is there any way that we can alleviate this and just, you know, not include that photo? It was handled pretty quickly. So, you know, it's just sort of that, one of those things where you know, I have to take a moment sometimes and pause and check myself and see if that will be received well. Luckily, it was a good thing that the photographer was also a Black person, and so I could be honest with them and be honest with the editors and just say, hey, I think that maybe we are not paying close enough respect and consideration to what stereotypes might come and to be harmful from this post. So.
Okay, so stepping up and having a voice in your newsroom. And Kelly, would you agree with Jared, or do you have additional thoughts to add?
Jared, of course, I agree with you. I always agree with you. I follow and love a lot of your thoughts. I just want to just kind of start by saying that bringing up discussions in the newsroom only because I'm a part of an organization where we deal with Black journalists, that sometimes this moment can be very heavy. And quite often when it comes to race, it a lot of times falls on that Black reporter or that Black producer or Black writer to be the voice for explaining what is racist or what isn't racist. And it's important to know that we had an emergency meeting just talking about how difficult it is to handle this moment, because there are a lot of questions coming to us about what to do and what not to do. I think it's important that it is the responsibility of everyone in the newsroom to really take a second, especially in this moment. I keep looking at this picture and I think about the coverage in Memphis, and we talk about using words and how we write about certain things, about interchanging protests with looters or rioters, and it's rioters, and it's not the same thing. And I see a lot of social media posts when they're talking about how angry they are with the looting that happened. And reality is there wasn't a whole lot of looting in Memphis, actually. That really wasn't the story. And but somehow that became the story. And I think it's just important that when we're talking and we're in our newsrooms to just really reiterate, it's important to tell the things that are sexy or the big things about the fire and all that. But it's always important to put things in context. Right. 90% of what's happening out there has been peaceful. And the story should be about why they are out there versus just about one particular thing. So I think it's making sure that the managers and people in newsrooms understand that it's important to tell the whole story every time. For a viewer who's just coming in and seeing one story, you got to be able to balance it all.
Thank you, Kelly. And honestly, we could continue with this picture probably for the entire hour and really have a lot more discussion. But then in the interest of time, we'll move to another picture. And this actually was an image done by a PR practitioner. And this is coming from an ad billboard the Monroe County Tourist Development Council did in May. And the idea was to say, hey, we're opening up following the pandemic and using the language of free at last, which has different historical context for African Americans, of course. When this went up, it was up for a period of time. I had to check into this today, and complaints immediately brought it down. And so I just say to my PR colleagues, the panelists, Connie and Kenneth, what do you do within your space to ensure that we have materials that are going out, statements that are being written that aren't tone deaf, for lack of a better way to say it? So Connie, I'll start with you. Kenneth, if you are ready, I'm coming to you next. Please unmute yourselves.
Well, it's important to, just a shameless plug, to visit places like the National Civil Rights Museum to understand why phrases like that are really just appropriated in the wrong way. Free at last, has been associated with, slavery and how, as a free people, we celebrated. And this coming in the month of June, when Juneteenth occurred, is really, really egregious. And so tone deaf is putting it mildly in this context, in my opinion. So I think it's also important to know that, when you vet among your team members and you say, this is the campaign we're going to push out at this particular time, it's important to have team members that represent a community that understands why something like this is tone deaf, So if there's a possibility of having diversity in that particular organization, or even consulting with one where if there's a lack of, then you have an ear toward an audience you're trying to approach. But I think this is probably we can understand that folks in this situation where there is a pandemic, want to assert a certain freedom, but it's not the same thing whatsoever, and it needs to be clear among those who are making these decisions.
Thank you, Connie. And of course, want to reiterate that this is one example. So I'm sure, Kenneth, you've probably seen many more as well. And so would love you to weigh in on just this or just other pieces that you've seen from PR practitioners and what we can do and the voice we can lend in order to prevent this type of activity.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think I agree. I definitely have seen this type of work done a lot over the years. I think ways we could prevent it is Grim is kind of allowing diverse staff members to be a part of these narratives, these conversations, as far as language around ads. But I think another big thing is not just allowing diversity amongst the conversation, but having diversity amongst the leadership that approve, right? I remember being a part of an organization and working as one of a group of communications team, right? And I was entry-level role. We had diversity in that space, and I was able to say, hey, I don't know about that. That image don't look right. I'm not sure about that text, but without any power, they say, nah, I think we just gonna go with it, and if we get some backlash, we'll move forward later. But I think it's about the level of power with that diversity. Do they trust your thoughts? Do they believe in the things that you're saying? And and they believe that, hey, this person has a pulse on what's right and what's wrong. Let's move forward with that. And also making sure that allowing them to be a part of the conversation in the beginning, right? So often we have Black people a part of the conversation once, things have been messed up. And I think, allowing those Black storytellers, those Black creators and copywriters to be a part of the brainstorming of content for advertising in the beginning would help a lot of this and avoid a lot of these challenges.
Well said, Kenneth. It's very important to be part of the conversation on the front end. You can even think about the fact that statements are coming from everywhere after the fact. But how much do we really talk about issues of racism before something happens? And I love that you mentioned decision-making. And I think that's just a good segue, and we should probably just move forward to talking about decision-making, which ultimately involves hiring, right? It's one thing to be hired, it's another thing to be hired in a position of power or decision-making or being trusted, as Kenneth referenced. This was a social media image that was floating around in the last couple of weeks, and Jennifer Sharp pulled it and said, hey, let's put this in. I thought it was great, but it really shows really how do we get people of color to the decision-making table in the C-suite or a newsroom. So I don't think we've heard yet from Elle. So Elle, if you could unmute yourself, I'd love your feedback on whether or how we go about getting more people of color in decision-making positions.
You have to hire them in the first place. Just kind of piggyback on what Kenneth said, like that is an important thing. Like you see all the newsrooms across the country that are having these reckonings, and people are getting fired and resigning and things like that. But if they bring in a person of color to some of these positions, if they don't have any even if they are in a leadership position, but, you know, you bring in this diversity and inclusion person, but if nobody really truthfully cares what they have to say, then it doesn't really make a difference. I don't know if I have the answer to this question. I think having them there in the first place and in greater numbers in the first place does help with that ascension.
You know, and I'd love to hear from any of the panelists who would feel comfortable speaking on this topic of really how do you get to a trusted advisor role within an organization to begin with? So many times you'll hear, I think as Kenneth mentioned, about the entry level hire, and then just, you know, stay entry level, do your job, toe the line. But there's a lack of interest at times by the organization to move that person or train that person or support that person to get to the trusted advisor role. So I would love any feedback that any of you are willing to provide for that question.
Well, I think an important thing, and I'm a shout out Kelly just because she mentioned earlier, I thought that was really a great answer about context and how important context is. And so that didn't necessarily apply directly here, but in a way it does, if I could provide some context just for, you know, how I, just being completely transparent, a lot of times I defer to Elle and when I have a question, because of the nature of our roles. She may not be in a senior leadership position, but in our enclave of Black reporters who work with our organization, I think, you know, I trust her judgment and a lot of times on how we might move forward as a united front to bring forward an idea or to push back against an idea. And so I don't know if there's anything to say for that, for those who built our own little families within certain organizations. You know, I believe in Elle's work, and I believe in how she's asserted herself within conversations with leadership in our organization. And we want, or I would love to see her reach that space where it is an official, you know, title and that sort of thing. But in another small note, and I'm sorry I don't want to speak too long, but there is one Black leadership role in our organization that I can think of that, you know, recently I received a call. Hey, has anyone called to check on you? Has anyone within the organization, he's not in the newsroom, has anyone within the organization given you a call and expressed their support with you during this time of what's going on out in the streets throughout the US in regards to Black Lives Matter? And he took it upon himself to say, hey, you know, we want to make sure that you have that sort of support. And so I was grateful that he was there and he is there, although he's not in the newsroom. He went out of his way to call me and make sure that that I knew that he, as an advocate and as a Black person in a leadership role within our organization, was going directly to make sure that there was a message internally about how we can be supported through our leadership in our office.
Love that. Love that.
Speaking of this one topic, Renee,
sure.
Because it's actually very simple, and I know you need to move on, but I say this and I preach this and I do believe in it. That diversity has to be intentional.
Yes.
It cannot just magically happen. Sometimes it does. It's beautiful. I know a lot of folks who are like, that's great. You know, diversity doesn't happen in the C-suite just by chance. Diversity doesn't happen in management roles, in newsrooms. You have to decide that is what's important to tell a story. That's important to make sure certain images like the one we just saw doesn't go on air. And it's not just important to hire diversity at the entry level. It is important to be in the room. It is important to be in the room when decisions are happening, because it's not just about reaching out when something happens. I always think about the stories that are not being told because somebody in a decision-making role is not pushing to make that happen. So for any organization, I use the example, like if like in TV, I work in television, if all the cameras stopped working all of a sudden, we wouldn't say, well, we ain't going on TV today. You know, it's like, we got to have cameras. This is a part of the job. we've got to get to a point where companies start to think like, golly, I cannot operate unless I've got enough diversity in my newsroom. So I make sure I'm having balanced coverage every single day. It's a decision. It's just a decision. That's that.
I love that. And I'm so glad that you made that point, you and Jared and Elle as well. But definitely having a diverse team makes the difference. Karanja is on the call, and I'm trying to put him on the spot, but he has a wealth of knowledge and a long history of working at newspapers in this city and beyond. And if he's available and willing to unmute himself, I would just love any feedback you'd be willing to give everyone on the call, Karanja, with regard to just becoming a trusted advisor as he's now editor of the Tri-State Defender.
Well, thanks for inviting me. We appreciate that very much. I do have the unique experience of working for the Tri-State Defender and having worked for the Commercial Appeal. So I've had my feet in both of those, and so I can sort of look at it that way. A couple of things that come to my mind: cultural competency. I remember once being at the Commercial Appeal, and they were going to hire a reporter. So they asked me for a recommendation, and I gave it to them. And so when they went and brought the gentleman in and interviewed him, and then they brought me back in, and they said, well, he's not an African-American. I said, well, you didn't ask me that. I mean, you asked for a good reporter, the best reporter available. I suggested this guy because he's culturally competent, okay? And that's the point that I want to make. It's not just being in the newsroom, diversity. You have to have culturally competent people in the room. And culturally competent means you got a handle on what's going on in this country relative to race and how it plays itself out, relative to journalism, relative to education, relative to religion, and all those things. So that when you're in the room, you have a cultural base to be able to draw from, so you've got something relevant to say. And then the second thing is you have to have courage. You have to decide for yourself, where is the line for you? And it's different for people. I worked 26 years, 6 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days at the Commercial Appeal. And there were a lot of different people came through, a lot of different African Americans, and people have to decide for themselves, where is the line going to be for you? For me, I decided that, hey, I was on the wrong trip. I didn't have a grip on language, that I was actually contributing to the problem. And so I went through a process to reorient myself, to debrief myself so that I could be a better participant when I got in the room. Well, that wasn't a smooth ride, not so much always because of the people at the top. But hell, we had people in the room of African Americans that they didn't understand it, and so I guess my thing is this: make sure that you're locked in on your craft. You need to be good at what you're doing. You need to be good at your craft. That's number one. Number two, you have to be culturally competent. And number three, you have to have courage. And you have to decide for yourself where the line is.
Love it. Thank you for sharing that, Karanja. I knew you had something to say. Knew you had something to bring to the table. And now I want to ask Connie a question, because we were talking briefly yesterday about this topic of being at the C-suite. And you know what, to be honest, C-suite isn't for everybody. Everybody's decision isn't to come to the C-suite within, honestly, a predominantly white corporation. For some, it's going a different route. And Connie, if you could just explain what other options you think are relevant and available for all of us.
Well, actually, I'm tagging on to what Mr. Karanja Janaku had just said. It's embracing the alternative media that's already speaking in these voices. It's just talking and understanding, the perspectives from a media source that's already covering these different communities that you may not have enough information about. It's understanding that your voice, your predominant whatever cultural voice you're speaking is not the only part of the story that can be told. So just embracing, excuse me, different alternative ethnic media, blogs that are telling stories, you know, from a millennial younger voice, and finding more relevancy in those spaces is important as well.
Absolutely. Connie, thank you.
Can I say something?
Please. And I don't know who it is, but.
Oh, sorry, Kenneth.
Oh,
I just wanted to tag in on the intentionality piece. When we talk about, like, I know everyone mentioned it, but what that looks like, right? When we talk about being intentional about hiring competent people, it's being intentional about putting your job descriptions in places where you know the audience is, right? I remember working in DC, and they came to me one day and said, Kenny, a lot of Black people aren't applying for this job. And my first question was, where are you promoting it, right? We have Howard University, you know, is any job, did you post it on that job description, that job board, right? We have Black newspapers and Black blog sites where you're able to post it on those situations. And they were like, no. And I'm like, well, you didn't even go to you went to your same place, the same way you've been doing it, and expect different results. And that's never going to work. So just that was something I wanted to make sure we put out as far as being intentional.
I think that was an excellent point, and so glad that you jumped in to give that thought to everyone, because it's true. You have to be intentional in hiring, especially if you're trying to establish a diverse group of leaders in your organization. So often people will say that they're not able to find a qualified person of color. If I haven't heard that 1,000,001 times, but it's not even just finding a qualified person of color, it's also making that person comfortable when they're there, and not making it a difficult or hostile environment for them to work and just continue forward. So any panelists, if you have anything else to share on that topic, please do. And if not, we want to move to a discussion that I think all of us have had in our newsrooms, in our places of business over the last few weeks. I think we all know these faces. I mean, obviously you remember Breonna Taylor, killed by police in her Louisville home. Of course, you remember George Floyd, just most recently killed by a police officer who literally just held his knee in Mr. Floyd's neck. And then, of course, Ahmaud Arbery was jogging on a Georgia County road when he was pursued and ultimately killed by 2 armed white residents. And so when you hear these stories, which are becoming way too plentiful, what is your responsibility? Not just Black panelists, but everyone. What is your responsibility when you are covering stories, when you are discussing this in your places of business, when you are drafting a statement just to say, hey, I'm sorry this happened? Should your statement go further in you encouraging people to take action? What is your role? So feel free, panelists, to kick things off. But I also hope we're able to get feedback from those who want to speak that are listening on this call today. So.
I guess I'll go, or you can go ahead. What I was going to say was, as a reporter, it's important for us to when we get these official accounts of things that happen, to qualify that this is what police said, this is what this government agency said, versus just running it unchecked. If there are ways to get witness accounts of that, to do that too. But even locally, you've seen cases of where outlets have run things that have said, hey, this person was doing this. And it doesn't say police said, it doesn't say this agency said. And then a video comes out and the video is not what the official statement said. Which, at the very least, you can be sued for libel or slander. So just to be very careful about that.
Okay, thank you, Elle. So one of our journalist panelists, either Jared or Kelly, if you want to weigh in, and then really want to talk to the PR pros about experiences they've had in recent days and weeks when being asked questions about these topics and how to respond to them.
Quite simply, I'll weigh in. I think it's important to report it. I don't think people really paid attention that locally that a lot of these stories were not making the news in any type of substance for quite some time. To be honest, it's probably right around the time the protest started that we finally started talking about this in a real way. And we were talking about the responsibility of reporting on things like this. I think it's important to go beyond seeing that video, that egregious video of George Floyd, of seeing that egregious video of Ahmaud Arbery, and talking about deeper issues. And I think we are finally having that conversation regarding police use of force. And these cases, while tragic and catch everyone's attention, should just be a jumping off point to talk about something much deeper and much more complicated that we as a country need to talk about.
Well put. I can't tell who was going to speak next, so please identify yourself and then start talking.
Well, this is Kenneth. I could jump in and bring from the PR standpoint. First, I'd like to just mention outside of that, Breonna Taylor's, nothing has been happening on that case. So just to make sure people know that no punishment has gone towards the people that that murdered this woman. So just keep that in mind as you go through the day. But as far as what we've been able to do as far as support, I think, you know, the small things really matter, right? One of our clients reached out and laid out an entire plan of some of the things that they wanted to do, wanted to say, you know, and I'm listening to the plan. I'm like, oh, that's nice. That's nice. And I just asked the question, I'm like, what have you checked on your staff? Have you checked on the people in your community, the vendors that may be African-American or struggling during this time? And they was like, oh, I didn't think of that. And I'm like, a lot of times we see what everyone else is doing and figure like, we need to do that same situation. And it's like, before you go into posting something on Instagram or anything like that, make sure like the people in your circle, you know, the people that's getting your emails on a normal basis that support your work, that's funding your work, check on them, give them a ring, like the leader did to JB, right? That call, hey, I just want to check in on you. We saw a thread on social media of how many people in your company checked on you, or how many white people that your friends, right, checked on you during this phase. So that's one of the things we want to push, like just small, tiny things, a text message, before we start going into big communication strategies, right? I think taking a step back and making sure people realize people are human and struggling with these situations, and we just need to talk like humans.
Excellent, excellent point. Just checking in. It seems so simple, but many people skip that step. Connie, wanted to reach out to you. Any thoughts with regard to what should we be doing in this moment that's even deeper than our coverage and our responses and so forth? What do you think we should be doing in this moment?
I think we are in a special moment right now. The pandemic has put a lot of us in situations we never would have anticipated and have responded to in a different way we may not have anticipated. But I think, you know, we need to check in with ourselves. You know, we need to check in with our implicit biases. We need to check in with, you know, how people are responding. There are racial implications, but there are mental, there are physiological things that are a part of the remnants of what's happening now. Whether it's a person who's watching on the sideline or if you are on the front line in protest. So we need to practice some self-care in the middle of this and examine why we are having these feelings. You know, what can we do about it? Connect with people who are, you know, have solutions or who are working towards solutions in this space. You know, I think we also, as PR people, have to be careful too. Everybody's jumping to, well, I have to make a stand and I want to be on the right side of history in this. And, you know, honestly, that comes from a long line of actions taken before now and after now. What you do now is going to be critical, I feel. And so there's a fine line also between taking positive steps towards social justice and pandering. So there's a, you know, you have to be really, really careful about how you land on this, because it really determines what you do next is critical. And it needs to be something that marks toward a solution.
Absolutely, absolutely. And pandering is taking place. I think we've all seen it, right? You know, I was looking at some of the comments that are being posted as we're continuing. And so, Milton, forgive me, but we need to go off script just a little bit. I'd really love to hear from Terry, who made a point about white privilege. And if you could unmute yourself, we would love to hear that point so you could share it with the team and what you were responding to specifically.
Hi, everybody. My name is Terry Durazo. I am a professor at U of M in the PR department. And yes, so I brought up, we're having a lot of these conversations in higher ed right now, especially public relations is a very white field. In higher ed, the professors tend to be white women. I know that I have students in here and they can agree that the 4 full-time faculty members at U of M in the PR department are white women. And so we've been starting to have conversations, you know, just around like recognizing that power needs to be redistributed. And that's hard. I think that's really hard for people to reckon with. They want to think that there is a, let me just sign this petition, let me just give this money and I've done my part. But really, to dismantle white supremacy takes a lot of work from white people. And it takes a lot of work that forces them to not get any credit for it. I'm pulling a lot from like activists that I follow on Instagram who are constantly making me sit as a white woman with uncomfortable feelings. I want to think like, oh, I've done this thing or that thing that makes me good. But inherently, you know, white supremacy means that as a white woman, I will do harm. Like that's just how that works. So these are just some of the things that I've been thinking about. I am by no means the expert on this. I'm happy to drop some of the accounts that I follow in the chat if that would be helpful for other people. But yeah, just to kind of come back to that original point, people are going to need to give up things in order for this to be truly meaningful and transformative. And I just think it's an important point to reckon with is like, it's about the hiring, but it's also about people stepping aside and saying like, I don't need to be here right now, and sponsoring and advocating for them within those spaces. So that's just kind of something that I've been thinking about in higher ed and how we can, you know, bring a little bit more justice and equity to that space particularly. Thank you for that opportunity.
Terry, say it again for the folks in the back. I really appreciate your comments and hope you do continue to just take the initiative to learn things beyond yourself and what you may have thought. And just thank you for sharing all of that, and welcome others that may have questions or have comments that you'd like to share. We'd love to hear from you. I think we saw a comment from Allie. And would love to hear, Allie, your comments and feelings on the topic, and panelists, if you have any reactions to what Terry said, we'd love to hear from you as well.
Did you say Allie?
I did.
I'm sorry, I had to take my earphone out for a second to respond to my 4-year-old. What was that you said again?
Well, we saw your comment come up and just thought it might be nice to hear from you on the call. So we'd love to hear any comments you'd like to share regarding anything you've heard here today.
Yes, well, shout out to Milton, who I have the distinct privilege of serving on PRSA Travel and Tourism Executive Committee with. I've learned so much from him and other friends of mine in the travel and tourism space. But, you know, one thing that is challenging for me is I grew up in Montgomery, Alabama. So around lots of diversity, went to diverse schools and have a lot of diverse friends. That doesn't mean that I have not experienced what I now understand as white privilege. That's not something, a term or a standard that I really understood until recent weeks. And so, you know, I've never been afraid to walk down the street or do normal day-to-day things that my Black friends or other friends of color have had to do. And I think the root of a lot of what's happening is a heart issue and something that I've really taken to heart. And you know, I'm in a community now that is not quite as diverse as where I grew up, but from talking to Milton and working as a public relations professional, just, you know, doing what I can in my corner of the world with not allowing racial derogatory terms or language to be said around me and affecting change in my household with my little ones. I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, and training them up to make a difference. And it goes beyond just like what Terry was saying, signing a petition or doing those things that are good. They are good things, but it's so much deeper than that, and it's affecting change in our industry, the way that we communicate, going back to the visuals and the language, just simple things that we can do really make a big impact. And I'm here to listen and to learn and to move forward and to be a partner in an advocate for change, and not just to sit by and let it be.
Love that commitment and just appreciate the comments throughout. And so I'll ask our panelists and also those listening, if you have questions, again, feel free to ask, and Milton will call on you. But to the panelists, what do you want people to walk away with after attending? Of course, it's an hour session. This is really a deep topic that we could go on all day about, but what do you want folks to walk away with? I'll start with Jared.
Well, I'm more than I am astonished by what's going on in the world right now and what's going on in much of our dialogue. I think what I want people to really know, and if I could be 100% frank, is that I'm tired, I'm jaded, I'm pissed off, and I think there should be a space for that. Allie, I've reported in Mobile. In Montgomery. I lived in Mobile, but I've been all up and down the state of Alabama. And this doesn't necessarily have anything to do with you particularly, but I one thing that really stands out about my experience there is even, you know, a lot of the people that when I lived in Mobile who wanted to help and who had a big heart didn't really understand that sometimes I just didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to be told that someone understood. I didn't want to be told that somebody wanted to understand. I mean, I sometimes I just wanted to figure it out. And sometimes I just wanted to maybe sit down and enjoy a concert or enjoy a glass of wine or you know, to go somewhere without someone telling me how they felt about how I should feel. And, you know, as a journalist, you know, so often people expect you to be objective and people expect you to know every side of everything that's happening. And people even call you and say, oh, you should know what's going on this Friday night because you're a journalist and that's what you do. You're a keeper of all information. But I'm also a keeper of a lot of emotions when I'm observing these things all the time. And so I'm not necessarily asking for anyone to feel bad for me or asking anyone to really be upset or hurt for me, but sometimes I just need the space to collect the information, because that's part of my job and that's what I have to do. And even when I want to maybe not plug in, I'm being asked to go out to a protest in the middle of COVID, or I'm being asked to read up about something that is hurtful towards me particularly, or I'm being asked to call Russ Graham in the middle of the flight situation, which I did. And it stinks sometimes. And sometimes I think what can be very helpful is for someone to understand that sometimes I might need my space too.
Jared, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And I feel like I don't want to speak for the panelists, but I know Jared touched on some points that everyone has felt at one time or another. And I'd be remiss if I didn't turn it over to Richard Thompson really quick from MABJ. I know that Kelly has been representing MABJ throughout this, but just would love for you to have a chance to share your thoughts also with the same thing to Jared about just in general, what do you think people should learn from this conversation?
Thank you, Renee. I just think that people should understand that this conversation isn't about what you lose or what you have to give up. This is a conversation about inclusion. This is a conversation about what we can gain by understanding that people have shared experiences. So I think that that's important. You know, yes, if you're a white woman, there's certain things, there's certain privileges that you have, but it's not about you losing something. It's about you understanding that the people around you also have something to give, and you can gain from what they can give. So everybody can come to the table at the same time and sort of bring their experiences, and we can have this exchange of ideas that Jared and Connie and the others have talked about, and Karanja has mentioned, the cultural competency that we're talking about here. But this is a conversation about growth and growing and experiencing and showing what our city is beyond what the typical narrative has been about Memphis that we need to combat. Thank you, everybody.
And thank you as well. Would like to check back in with Elle. I don't think we had enough chance to hear from Elle throughout, so wanted to give you one last opportunity as a panelist, because we've only got limited time, but just to hear, is there a last thing that you would like for everybody to walk away from this?
Sure. I actually agree with both Jared and Richard. With Jared, the part I agree with is make sure you have a relationship with this person before you check in with them, because some people, I don't know, people have different thoughts about the different people in their lives, and some people that you might consider friends might just consider you a coworker. So, you know, to bring really heavy topics may feel kind of intrusive. Mm-hmm. So just try to gauge if that person really wants you to check in with them, because they may want you to leave them alone. And I agree with Richard. I think the importance or the emphasis should be on, without these different people in the room and at the decision-making table, like, we lose these fuller experiences without having certain people who are reporting on the news, who are anchors, who are in leadership positions at newspapers, who are photographers. We lose these photos that we wouldn't have, stories getting told, these campaigns that you don't have without these people there. So you need to have this diverse group to make you know, the experience fuller, and it's helpful.
Understood. So we are at 12:25, and I know there are some messages that have to be delivered by PRSA at the end of this. I want to leave time for that, but also want to leave time to just say thank you. Just thank you, Jared. Thank you, Elle. Thank you, Connie. Thank you, Kenneth. Thank you, Kelly. And most of all, thank you, Milton, for being courageous in the organization in which you work, to ensure that a topic like this is brought forth and shared. Also to MABJ for always just trying to have relevant conversations for everybody in attendance. Just thank you for attending and showing that this is important to you. And hopefully this will shape some of the conversations moving forward. And I wanted to say to Keisha Whitaker, who's on, we appreciate your comment as well, and your interest in the topic. And I too wish we had another hour to go. And so with that, I want to toss things back over to Milton to wrap things up for us. And just thanks again, Milton, for your leadership in this opportunity.
All right. Thank you all for, can you all hear me okay? Okay, perfect. Just want to make sure. I've been sitting here in the background for so long. But no, thank you all. Thank you everyone for joining in this conversation today. And I do want to add in just my little 2 cents that I hope as a takeaway that I hope you guys, everyone on this panel, and take away today. You know, over the last week in the travel industry, in the industry that I work in for PR, there's been this organization called Black Travel Alliance that has been holding DMOs and destinations and attractions and across this country accountable for their part in making sure that influencers, Black influencers and Black journalists are covered and included in what they do in their PR and media outreach. And I bring that up to say, regardless of, you know, the instantly pushback that I saw some of my peers in the industry do was, why should I have to respond to this organization who's trying to hold me accountable? Why do I have to give them this information, proving that I'm diverse, proving that I'm doing the work? And I say, you know, to those people, you know, that instantly got offended by it, you literally have to take a step back. Whenever someone is challenging you on the conversation, you have to literally take it back and analyze, why do I feel threatened, and why am I heightened in this situation? And you have to take that moment to think about, okay, how do I feel about that? And is this a factual, real experience? Or am I observing my privilege that I even feel that someone even has the audacity to even come to me and ask that question? When, you know, and I had this conversation with a colleague that has to say, you know, who are you to say how someone should approach with the issue? The point should be to focus upon whatever the issue is. And for the Black Travel Alliance, it was they're trying to prove that there's not diversity within the travel industry. And so I say that to say, before we get offended, we must always examine our intellect and examine our own thought process, and our own biases, regardless of who we are, and to make sure that we're making decisions that are based upon not our bias, but based upon, you know, getting to the truth and the root of the matter. You know, I think, you know, in closing, I'm going on a tangent here, but to guide your media and PR outreach, you have to know morally where you stand. And you have to morally know where your organization stands. And just as the other said on this webinar today, you have to know where you stand at that line and where your responsibility lies in moving the conversation forward. So I hope you all leave this webinar understanding and learning, and hope you move forward with finding where you are in this moment and finding where you are on that line and what your role is moving the conversation forward. Just as my colleague Ali spoke earlier, we all have a responsibility to play in understanding and reaching out and pushing the conversation forward. And so we have to understand what that is and look at ourselves, understand where we are in a place, and own what we've done wrong and what we should do moving forward. So I can go on that. But anyway, thank you all for joining in on this conversation. I hope all of us, all the 90-something people that tuned in on this, take this conversation and connect with the other individuals in this country, the hundreds of thousands of them that were not on this call, and connect with them and have this conversation, because we can't solve it within an hour, but this is a start on something that is great, hopefully for PRSA Memphis, as well as the Memphis Black Journalists Association. So thank you all for joining in. I'm gonna fast forward, and if you wanna tweet about this conversation, we are gonna post it later on YouTube so you can follow, but here's the social media channels there where you can find and share to the world about the lovely panel that we had today. And also there's the website, prsamemphis.org, or the MABJTN.org, where you can also, if you want to learn more about the organizations that hosted this webinar today. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to Renee for structuring this conversation. Thank you to Kelly. Thank you to Elle. Thank you to Jared. Thank you to Kenneth. And thank you for all the special guests. I hope you all have a good rest of your week. And hopefully I'll meet some of you guys in person at some point in the future. But thank you again. And you all have a good rest of your day. Thank you for attending.